Hi, this is Taylor Otwell, and I'm back with part 2 of our screencast on using the Laravel 4 IOC container. In this screencast, I'm going to show you some great practical ways to really leverage this IOC container to make your application much more flexible and testable. So, in the last screencast, we looked at just some basic examples of how to resolve things out of the IOC container and what it can do for you. But in this example, we're going to tie it all together and show you what practically can this do in your application. How can it make it more testable? Okay, so let's jump right in. First, I've got an example controller I want us to look at. This is just your typical controller, and what this method is going to do is get the most popular users from our database and bind them to a view and return that to the user. So this is pretty simple. Now you can see in this controller action, I'm using Eloquent directly here. I'm just saying user where popularity greater than 100 get. Okay, so this is how most people probably write their controllers, and this is a fine way to write your controllers. However, as you get more into test-driven development or just trying to test your application in general, you may notice that it's difficult to test active record style implementations or active record style ORMs like Rails Active Record or like Eloquent. Now, the reason for that is we're using this explicitly in the route. We're not passing in any kind of abstraction or dependency that we can easily mock. So it's really difficult to test this without hitting a real test database, which is not really something you want to do from your controller. You want your controller to be totally oblivious to whatever back-end technology you're using to store your data. You don't want it to be tightly coupled to a particular ORM or a particular data store. So let's go ahead and take a look at an alternative here. And I've got another controller coded up which shows an alternative. Now this controller, instead of using Eloquent directly in the route, you can see we're passing in a user repository in our constructor. And we're going to use this repository as a nice abstraction layer on top of our database interaction. So instead of calling Eloquent directly to get the most popular users, I'm going to call the get most popular method on my user repository. Now, what is user repository? It is actually not a class, it is an interface. I like to think of interface like contracts. Sometimes I even call them contracts. And that's because if I have an implementation of a given interface, it's like a contract. It's like a guarantee that the implementers of this interface are going to provide certain methods, and I'm going to be able to call those and expect certain results. And it's like a predefined contract API for implementers of these interfaces. So when my controller gets an implementation of user repository, it knows that get most popular is one of the available methods on that contract. Okay, so all we need to do is write an implementation of the contract, which I've already done, just a simple array user repository. This is just going to return dummy data, not return anything from a real data store. Now our array implementation, you can see, just returns array Dale, who is the most popular Laravel user of all time. And this is just a sample, but you could have other implementations. For example, what benefit does it give you to inject this interface? Well, first let's look at how we bind it in the IOC container. We haven't actually told the container what implementation of the user repository to inject. So when I hit my route for this controller, let's see what we get. We get an exception that says binding resolution exception, target user repository is not instantiable. Now an interface is not instantiable on its own. You have to instantiate an implementation of the interface, like our array user repository. So the container is just telling you, hey, your controller needed a user repository, but I have no idea which implementation you want me to give. Okay, so we need to inform our container here what to do. And we're going to use the same app bind method that we saw in the last screencast. I'm going to say app bind user repository, which is our interface or contract, and we're going to bind that to array user repository. Okay, so now what we're telling the IOC container here is when you need a user repository implementation, use the array user repository. Okay, so now practically what does this do for you? You're injecting an implementation of an interface. Your boss comes to you and says, hey, we're done with array user repository, we're moving up to Mongo, and we want to store all our user data in Mongo. How long is it going to take to migrate our application? Okay, you're in luck because you've abstracted your application really nicely. All you need to do is write a new implementation of this contract, Mongo user repository. Okay, so what that's going to look like is something like this, except it's going to be Mongo user repository, and right here you're going to return fancy Mongo query stuff. Okay, so you've written your new implementation, and now instead of injecting our array user repository, all we're going to do is come in routes and say, hey, instead of using array user repository, we've switched. We're now using Mongo user repository, and it's going to be automatically injected into your controller. And remember, your controller doesn't care. He doesn't know the difference. He doesn't care what backend data store you're using. You just switched to Mongo, and you didn't have to tweak any of your controller code. It's automatically going to work because we're still abiding by our user repository contract. Okay, so that's an easy way to just swap out implementations, and it's going to be pretty impressive when your application is this flexible and you're able to swap out implementations so easily. Okay, let me just get rid of this dummy file, and let's bind back to our array user repository. Okay, so now that we're bound, we should be able to hit this route, and I'm just going to go ahead and dump out the users here so we can see that we are actually using our array user repository. Let's go ahead and hit this again, and you can see there's our array with Dale. So our array user repository was in fact injected into this controller, and we used it successfully. Now, let's take a look at what this does for our testability. We're getting our users and we're binding them to the view. So in our test, we just want to make sure that this method, this show welcome method, that it actually calls our user repository with the right method, and that it does in fact successfully bind whatever it gets to the view. Now, we can do this using some of Laravel 4's great testing facilities. Testing is vastly improved. I've already got the test written. Let me scroll down. We're using Mockery to do some mocking. It's a great testing library available on packages through Composer. And I've got my test written right here with some comments. Now you can see we want to mock the user repository. So we're going to ask Mockery to give us a mock of that class or that interface. And I'm going to say that my mock repository should receive the getMostPopular method one time, and we're just going to tell it to return foo. We don't really care what it returns. We just want to make sure that it actually does bind foo to the view and returns it from the route. Okay, now we can access our application or our IOC container right from our test using this app. We could also use, if we wanted to, we could say app bind or app instance. It's not really going to matter. So now once we have our mock bound, we're ready to call the route and then get the original content. Now this original content is going to give us the view that was actually bound onto the route. Once we have the view, or once we have the response, we're just going to assert that the response has an OK status and that foo is actually equal to view users. So I hope you're following me here, but what we're doing is mocking the repository. We're using this call, which is a wonderful new method in Laravel 4. You can actually call your controllers right here from the test and examine the response statuses, the content, whatever you want. This is powered by the powerful browser kit component from Symfony. So we're leveraging some Composer components. We're leveraging the PHP community. Okay, and then we make just a couple assertions to make sure our controller is working properly, and now we are ready to test. So we can run PHP unit, and when it comes back here, there we go, our test passed. So that is how you use the IOC container to build a flexible application.